This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. My guest today is Dr. Daniel Reinhardt. Dr. Reinhardt had a long career in policing and now teaches at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. He is the author of the brand new book, Rethinking the Police, An Officer's Confession and the Pathway to Reform, out November 21st on IVP Academic. In this book, Reinhardt explores how policing has dramatically deviated from its original intention and how a new model of police leadership could bring about much needed change. We will be discussing this book on the show today. Dr. Reinhardt, welcome to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you for having me.
Hey, this is going to be a good conversation. The book's incredible, and I'm actually kind of sad that my listeners are going to have to wait about a month before the book comes out to read it. But before we get into the content of the book, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and your work.
Yeah, so I was born and raised in a community called Lorain, Ohio, just west of Cleveland. And it's a blue collar, well, it was a blue collar town, had a steel mill and a Ford plant. Lost the Ford plant and the steel mill and kind of gravitated towards urban poverty. And that's the same community that I served as a police officer for 24 years.
Yeah, so that is a really interesting part of your story. You made a very radical career transition from being a full-time police officer to being in academia. What motivated you to make that switch?
Yeah, so at first it really wasn't like an intentional switch. At 36 years old, I had been a Christian for a little over 10 years, and I always wanted to go to college. I went to the military and then became a policeman, so I never went to college. So just for desiring an education and a Christian education, I started my undergrad at Moody Bible Institute at 36, and then I heard there was something called seminary, which I really wasn't aware of. And so I was a small group leader in my church. So I went to seminary, finished a Master of Divinity. And in that time, I became aware of like doctoral studies and knew that Southern had a PhD in leadership. And, it wasn't too far from the Cleveland area. It was about a 5-hour drive. So I moved towards, finishing a terminal degree, and it was at Southern that I wrote my dissertation, which becomes the basis for this book. So once I finished my PhD, I was right at the retirement age and time. I had the time to retire. So I retired from policing and ended up transitioning to working at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary.
Yeah, well, the title of your book it perfectly describes the theme of the book, which is just that, rethinking the police. And you had been a police officer for a very long time, and it's very obvious from the conversations that are happening around policing in our society that there are issues that are going on, but it seems like there are various ways that people are trying to deal with those issues that might not be very clear. And in your book, you try to outline a clear path forward for policing. So what made you question the American policing profession, and then what motivated you to write a full-length book on it?
Well, so early, I became a Christian about a year after becoming a police officer. And so my Christian faith and sort of the way we sometimes treated people, or the way I treated people, I started to feel that conflict there. Later on, I became a police lieutenant, and then just my understanding of pastoral leadership and compared to the way I saw police leaders generally lead, I knew there was something wrong and there was a problem. And then in my doctoral studies, when I was looking what to write on, and focusing on leadership, I knew that there was this issue in policing due to leadership. I thought pastoral leadership could help fix the problem, or that you could lead sort of in that way. And also police brutality after like Michael Brown is just an escalating issue. So it was kind of like just the collision of all these things that I focused my dissertation on that became the book.
Well, your book is broken up into two different sections. The first one is about how policing became problematic and then what needs to be done to fix it, which is the second part of your book. And your first chapter is very helpful because it outlines the history of modern policing. And I think that there are a lot of misconceptions about the role of police officers and where they came from. So walk us through the history of modern policing.
Yeah, so, ironically, policing started with like a focus on peacekeeping. And it's Sir Robert Peel, who was a Christian, reacting to British evangelicals, because they're in Great Britain at this time, that they didn't feel that the policing was as humane as it should be in Great Britain. So he drafts these 9 principles. Basically, when I look at them, I see a Christian foundation, and I think most Christians would. And so American police departments in the mid 1800s adopt those principles as they're forming the first modern police departments. There's some precursors to modern police departments, but the first modern police departments in major cities are formed based on these principles. And the difference between the American police and the British police is that American police, they're not national police officers. They're municipalities. So they end up being governed by kind of corrupt politicians. The good thing about the police at that point, though, is that they're really involved in peacekeeping and social activities. But due to the corruption, they had to begin to reform the police, because by the 1920s and 30s, the police are described as completely corrupt and brutal in the United States. So the solution to the corruption was to pull the police out of the communities, focus them less on social activities and more on enforcement. And I argue that began to create a culture of social distance. So that reaction by police reformers, which was it was a good response to move the police away from the corrupt politicians, give police chiefs authority to try to clean up the police departments, launches the professional phase of policing. And now they're focused more on crime control, primarily through enforcement, and just enforcing the law and being distant from the public. By the 1960s, that distance, I think, is just growing and growing, particularly between white police departments, which the majority of police officers at this time are white, and Black communities. I argue in the book that social distance led to dehumanization, where the police are siloed and there's this us versus them mentality that develops. So the police begin to dehumanize sometimes the most challenging clientele, which can tend to be racial minorities. And so that social distance then leads to abuse. In the 70s and 80s, there's lots of research and a move towards community policing. They're realizing there's a problem because the 1960s erupts with this violence. And so they're trying to make adjustments in the 70s and 80s. I come on in the 90s, and this move towards community policing that I would argue never really took place. But we're seeing the moving back towards, or realizing that we lost our connection with the community. That's related to a lot of the tension. But 9/11 happens, and in the book I argue that is the launch of intelligence-led policing, which I think brings us right back to the professional era, where we're just focused on enforcement and social distance. And I argue in the book, too, that it targets communities of color. But that's basically the history. The irony of the history is that the solution to the corruption and the brutality was to pull the police from the public, which began to create a culture. And I talk about in that culture is this trend of social distance, dehumanization, and abuse. So the supposed cure to the brutality and the corruption built a culture that is now continuing to perpetuate this brutality and not corruption, but biased enforcement.
Yeah, I want to talk about that culture for a minute, because that is a really big theme in the early part of your book. And you talk about how, even up to this day, that abuse of power and dehumanization is just part and parcel of police culture. So is it just a combination of public policy regarding police officers, or is it something about how whenever anyone's given any power, they have a hard time not using that power to their own advantage? Do you think that there's some sort of combination of those two things going on, or how would you define the problem as it exists in 2023?
Yeah, so human history is replete with power abuse. If you give somebody power, it's tend to be abused. Police leaders have, because the strict hierarchy and the police chief was adopted to clean up the corruption, which is a fast way to clean up the corruption. But now you empower police leaders with great positional power. So when you have a lot of positional power, you don't have to lead by influence. You can give orders. And when you have a lot of positional power, it's easy to be a tyrant or engage in toxic leadership, abusive practices. And so it's just the nature of power and position. Well, police officers in the community, at the end of the day, we have a lot of power. We can ask, but we can also arrest you, so we can enforce. And it's just, I think, the nature of anytime you give people strong positional power, it can be abused. And if you enter a culture that dehumanizes, and that culture has positional power, then it becomes very dangerous, because it's going to promote that abuse.
Yeah, and you talk a lot about how the hierarchy of policing creates those kinds of abuses and kind of perpetuates a toxic culture within police departments. And you actually give a lot of really good anecdotes in your book. Like you have a lot of personal stories about how you were on the receiving end of some of that, and how that was really challenging for you. I think that there are a lot of people that don't understand how the chain of order works for police departments. So walk us through that hierarchy, why the hierarchy is and why the hierarchy is necessary. Because you make the point, like you guys are making life and death decisions every single day, so you have to have somebody at the top giving orders. Like that's the only way that it's going to work. But walk us through how that hierarchy works, why you need hierarchy, and then again, you've kind of alluded to it already, but why that hierarchy often breeds toxicity.
Yeah, so there's some variations in this, but generally speaking, you're going to have a chief. He's the top officer. He has, control of the organization. It's not a democracy. And then you're going to have a number of captains, maybe 3 or 4, or depending on the size of the police department. I was on a police department that had approximately 150 personnel, so we had 3 captains. And then we had 6 lieutenants, and then we had, I think, 15 sergeants, and then however many line officers, dispatchers, jailers, civilian employees, and so on. But each position has authority over, and control over their subordinates. And at the end of the day, you have the authority to give commands and orders. In fact, you can be disciplined for insubordination as a police officer, which is not following an order. And it is necessary because there are situations in policing where there's just not time for a committee to be formed or to try to reach a general consensus. The captain gives the lieutenant an order and it has to be followed, or much like the military, because you're in these type of dangerous positions, to hesitate can cost lives and can be very dangerous. So, I argue in the book that the hierarchy can lead to abuse, toxicity, and, just the abuse of power. However, it is essential because of the police mission, and you have to find a way to deal with the abuses of the hierarchy, because if you throw out the hierarchy in policing, I just don't think it could function the way that it needs to.
Yeah, and I think the model that you outline in the second half of your book addresses that problem head on. But before we get there, you have a little bit in the closing chapter of the first section of your book, you kind of get a little philosophical there. And you explain that police departments almost unanimously embrace a utilitarian ethic towards
Yeah.
their work. So talk to us about what that utilitarian ethic means. And then you also demonstrate how that utilitarianism has led to strategic or intel-based policing, which has generated a lot of the abuses that we've seen in the media. So walk us through that last chapter of the first half of your book.
Yeah. So the utilitarian ethic, essentially, that the end result is going to justify the means. And the war on drugs is probably the perfect example of that. And all these people were arrested with drugs and guns and various things. And that justified the means in which we did it. We targeted certain communities. We enforced there in a way that we didn't in other places. And then the answer for why that was okay was because look at the drugs and guns that we were able to get and the people that are arrested. And, so the end result justifies why we did it. But Michelle Alexander brings this up in her book. This goes on in urban communities till this day. But if we did that on a college campus, for instance, and said, but look at all the date rapes we stopped and the drugs we found, but we were just pounding these college campuses with stop and frisk, traffic stops, no tolerance, zero tolerance policing, where people are cited for every little infraction, and we flooded with the police departments, how long would it last? And we wouldn't be able to say that, well, the ends justify the means. But in police thinking, it does. And where it's done in urban communities, the same pushback isn't there. But that's assumed in policing. Another good example, this would probably be the stop and frisk debate. And I would have been on this side. If you bring up to policing the idea that we can't search people based on reasonable suspicion, they will just think it's completely outrageous. And they will point to, how many guns I've got, how many drugs I've found. But what we won't say is, well, we stopped 30 people in their own neighborhood that wouldn't have been stopped in another neighborhood. And these type of tactics go on there to get that one gun. And is it right in and of itself? That type of thinking just never really entered my mind. And I've never heard like a philosophy of ethics debate among police officers. So I don't know if that answered the question.
Yeah, it does. And then how does that connect itself towards the strategic or intel based policing. It's just the fact that there's certain data about the kinds of crime that police departments think are going to be on their streets, and so they target all of their methods towards addressing those crimes. Or how does that work?
Yeah, so intelligence-led policing, and I cover this. It'll purport that it can be used with community policing and other variations, but intelligence-based policing essentially gives the police the information where crimes occur. So through crime mapping, you'll be able to see where the crimes are, and in those areas, you then concentrate your efforts. Now, intelligence-led policing doesn't say you have to do it a certain way. It's just telling you where the crime is. However, because of the police culture, and I think because of the nature of intelligence-led policing, where we're not talking about neighborhoods, you're just talking about statistics. You tend to not remember these are dynamic communities of people, not just hot spots on a map where we see robberies and burglaries and drugs and these things. So essentially, what the police will usually do, if they're honest, is they send police officers into those areas in higher numbers, which isn't necessarily wrong, but they'll implement a zero tolerance strategy, which means they're going to enforce everything from jaywalking to no turn signal to things that you would never do anywhere else, to try to make stops, find things, and the idea is to deter crime by enforcing the small things. The big things don't happen. And that's where the utilitarian ethic comes in. It's going to be, that practice is going to be justified based on the so-called outcome, the number of arrests we make, and so forth. But very seldom do we stop to say, was this the right thing to do in and of itself? How many people have become, victims in their own neighborhood and then stopped and given tickets for all these minor things, and they're not selling drugs and they're not carrying guns, and you usually don't have conversations about that. But intelligence-led policing, if you bring up biasness and racism, like, well, this is happening in Black communities, it'll fall back and say, well, this is just statistical, so it's completely objective. How can it be biased? Again, back to the college argument. If we did that on college campuses based on statistics, I think people would make different arguments. But when it happens in poor communities of color, it tends to get overlooked.
Well, in the second half of your book, you attempt to address ways that police culture can be changed. And you argue that the only way that real change can be made in policing is if police adopt a servant-oriented model, kind of getting back to its Christian roots like it was under Peel. But you also note that this model must be reworked in order to be effective in the context of policing. So talk to us about the need for more of a servant-oriented model and why that might need to be reworked in a police context.
What I argue is that, so when they try to fix the police or reform the police, they do it through police leadership. But if they're toxic and oppressive, and my argument is their toxic, oppressive tactics are reciprocated by police officers against people. So essentially, they're training them to be a certain way in the field. So the leadership is the problem. So if you try to use oppressive leadership to reform the police culture, as I show in the book, is the true power in policing. They're going to fight back. That's why we never get anywhere. So a servant-style leadership changes the leadership. So rather than using coercion and positional power to change your officers, you're trying to develop a relationship with them. You're trying to develop trust with them, not to coerce them, but to convince them of a better way, to truly change them. So you have to change the leadership to change the culture. Policing can't be reformed until the culture's changed, because the culture will always push back. And again, if oppressive leaders try to change things in policing, it just strengthens the pushback and you don't get anywhere. So leadership, changing culture then supporting a different strategy. But the servant leadership model, I basically put a synthesis between servant leadership from Greenleaf, which can be seen weak in policing. That's one of the criticisms, with a pastoral form of leadership that's, I think, more firm and more directed toward, doesn't abandon discipline in this process. And that synthesis then creates a model that can be applied specifically in police departments to transform that culture and those three problematic aspects of the culture specifically, which are social distance, dehumanization, and abuse.
Your model, which is incredibly well laid out in the book with charts and graphs and everything like that, is called the shepherd servant leadership model. So there are several principles that you outline for the shepherd servant leadership model. Walk us through that, because that it really is at the heart of your book and the heart of your case for police reform. So explain to us what shepherd servant leadership looks like, what the principles are that it is based on, and how that would work in a police context.
Yeah. So remember, the problem I'm saying is that social distance, dehumanization, abuse, and officers has been reciprocated by the social distance between the hierarchy of ranks, the dehumanization of officers beneath them, and the abusive practices of leaders. So that trend is in the leadership. So that's the problem in the leadership. So my model starts with the first principle is that as a leader, you are a follower first. You follow the department mission, and I define the mission and the ethics of policing. Police leaders often assume that they have an intrinsic authority. Like a common way you'll see that is that this is what bothers me. Well, as a police leader, it doesn't matter what bothers you. What does the mission say? If you're a follower first, you don't place yourself in a position where you are the authority. So this humble position of you're a follower first, the follower of the mission statement and the laws and ethics of policing, which are essentially grounded in the people. So you're following the people first to lead your people, following the public first to lead your officers, rather. The second principle is that you're one with the community officers. You aren't distant. So we have to overcome this social distance. There has to be a personal nature to police leadership. Sometimes that gets discouraged in police leadership books, that you need to maintain this distance. I'm not talking about being buddies with them and going over their house, but I'm talking about being relational, caring, a shepherd, so to speak, like a pastor is over his officers, so that you can influence and you don't come across like a tyrant. And the third principle is the judicious and benevolent use of power. There needs to be serious checks on positional power. You have to intentionally make sure you're not abusing positional power, or you will by nature. Positional powers, I would say, a lot like a getting in shape. What do you have to do to get out of shape? Nothing. You naturally do it. If you have positional power, if you don't check it, you'll naturally abuse it. It's just what happens. It's organic. And the last thing is that it's founded in this mission of justice and peace. So you'll see statements related to the police mission, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, well, what I argue is that policing's central mission, no matter what their mission statements say and policies say, is enforcement. What I argue is it should be peacekeeping, and enforcement is a subcategory of peacekeeping. So you enforce to keep the peace. The goal isn't enforcement, and that's a philosophical shift in police thinking.
Yeah. So how would that shepherd servant model lead policing back to that peacekeeping model?
So you would have to transform the culture, right? And then I argue for the strategy. So the current strategy that fits so well with policing, whether it's official or unofficial, is the intelligence-led zero tolerance. Go in and find the place to enforce and enforce hard. That culture will never align with community policing that's talking about building relationships, problem solving, coming together with the community as a whole to deal with underlying issues of crime. So the servant leadership model, if it transforms the culture, can truly uphold a what I argue for procedural justice and community policing, because the culture would be organic with that strategy. The leadership would be organic with the culture, and it's just a symmetrical relationship. Whereas now it's toxic leadership, abusive officers, oppressive strategies. It's linear, but it's going the wrong direction. You have to transform all three to really reform the police.
I really love this model, and I think that it has a lot to offer for it. But you spend the final two chapters of your book addressing the complexities of implementing this model. And certainly there are going to be a lot of people within the police institution that would reject the implementation of this model because it's different than what they know. I mean, I'm a public school teacher, so I understand just how difficult bringing change to those institutions can be. So how would you go about implementing the shepherd servant model in police departments? And do you feel optimistic that real change is possible?
Yes, real change is possible. However, I think, and I don't necessarily cover this in the book, I think more external pressure is needed that's directed at internal change and through a change in police leadership. But to do this model can be done, but it would have to be done by a police chief. It could be done at small levels by a sergeant. He can lead that way. I think as a police lieutenant, it's largely how I led, but it would have to be done by a police chief. You would have to have intentional training to do it. You'd have to have leadership training to do it. And there would probably be some natural attrition that would have to take place. There's some people that would probably never get in line and you would just have to move through. And it may take a number of years. Someone asked me, how long may it take? I said, well, it could take a decade. But it took us over 100 years to get where we're at. You're not going to fix it in 6 months. It's good. A long-term solution is needed. Anybody who comes up with a quick solution, it isn't a solution. It may look like one on paper, but it won't work. And that's what's time and time again been shown that not work. So it's going to take an investment and the realization that you're not getting out of this in 6 months. You have to work at it and progress towards it.
Yeah, there are a couple of issues that you address tangentially in your book that I think my audience would be really interested in. So I want to ask you a couple of general questions just about policing in America. And one of them that I didn't send you beforehand, and I apologize for this, but there's definitely a perception about policing that is given to the American public by the media, and it's generally a very negative perception. What does the media get wrong about policing?
Well, so what type of media are you talking about? You talking
so whenever you turn on the news, and it doesn't really matter which side of the news you're on, they tend to emphasize and highlight only police brutality, but there's never any news coverage of police departments performing good tasks for their community, for instance.
Yeah, well, there's that, and I would say that there's an unrealistic expectation and understanding of when and how police should use force. Most of the media don't seem to be from what I can see in the analysis I hear, well versed or understand the Supreme Court laws that govern police force, the reality of using force. Force can be ugly. And what's happened is, although I know many police brutality incidents, now incidents that aren't necessarily police brutality, and what I mean by police brutality is they're not violations of Graham v. Connor or the primary decisions that govern force. They're all lumped together, where officers are just assumed to be guilty of police brutality if they see any exertion of force by the police. And so they'll just call something that's police brutality or excessive that isn't. That's how I see it misrepresented. And then the cases that are truly a problem, it doesn't do them any service, because people are going to argue that, that we don't have a problem with police brutality if you're showing incidents that aren't police brutality and calling it police brutality.
So it's just hard. It's hard to win either way with those conversations. And I think, again, a lot of people, it's like with anything else. People, they turn on the news and they see a snapshot of what it's like to be a police officer, and they assume that snapshot represents the entire profession.
Yeah, the other thing they assume is that police officers are highly trained, UFC fighters or something, and they're not. Some of them are
right.
Middle-aged guys. Some aren't very athletic, and any idea that they can, train you. We trained more than most police departments 7-8 times a year in defensive tactics training, where you do really no live applications. Because if you did live applications with 40-plus-year-olds, can you imagine if you sent a police department to a wrestling practice? You put half of them in the hospital. But that's what you have to do to train to be truly proficient at controlling somebody or be superior. Well, that's an unrealistic expectation of a police officer. So when they see that the officer just didn't put him in the pinky hold and subdue him, whatever that is, they're surprised when they see a police officer hit somebody. But sometimes the only way to put down aggression is through greater aggression.
Yeah.
And that's just a sad reality of living in a fallen world.
Yeah. And I think something that other people, and one of the things I really liked about your book is how many stories you have. Like, every single chapter opens up with a personal story from your career. And I've often said this before too, because I know that there are a lot of libertarians like me that are all about defund the police and all of that. And I believe policing is absolutely necessary to protect our natural rights. I'm not in that camp at all. And I also, since I've known a lot of police officers, and I myself have never been in a position where somebody's been pointing a gun at me or where I felt that my life was in danger. I can only imagine that I would act maybe even worse than some of the people that wind up on the news if I was put in a position where I thought that my life was threatened, and you don't have very much time to think it through. I mean, there's got to be a big adrenaline component to that, right? It's just that people don't understand what it's like to be in the moment, having, you talk in the book about how you chased somebody with a gun and he was hiding in a bush, and you received a command to stop where you were at. And had you continued on, that guy probably would have shot you. So I think a lot of it's just that, right? That there's all this pressure in the moment, and you have to make a snap decision, and it's not always possible to make the right one.
No, I mean, some people would ask me, I think police officers are afraid. And they would say, have you ever been afraid? And I say, all the time. What human being wouldn't be afraid when they're fighting with another man? There's some level of fear, and that's just normal. So there's another misconception with the media. Well, police officers aren't afraid. We're human beings. Your heart gets pumping, but if you notice, the difference between most police officers and regular people is we both feel fear, but people run away from the threat. Police officers, though they feel fear, run towards the threat, and that's what makes them police officers. But they are human beings, and they do feel fear. You do feel adrenaline. You're not going to make perfect decisions in a dynamic physical confrontation. It's just humanly impossible.
Yeah, another thought I've had about all this is I feel like we just have way too many laws in this country, and I think that sometimes police officers are required to enforce laws that just create more incidents with the community. And if those laws didn't exist, then we wouldn't have those problems. And in your book, you reference several times the war on drugs and the militarization of police. Both of these issues are very important to libertarians like me. What are your thoughts on those two issues, and how would your model address those two issues in particular?
Well, when the overarching goal is peacekeeping, then maybe enforcement of crimes that aren't taking the peace out of your community don't become a priority. Because there's tons of laws on the books. But, enforcing these laws and going after certain things, does it bring peace to the community, or does it create more tension? What have you accomplished at the end of the day? I think that becomes a critical question for the police. And if your goal is peacekeeping, and guess what? We all understood that during the George Floyd incident. I don't think anybody was worried about enforcing littering laws when they had people ready to riot, were they? So you instinctively already know that as a police officer. But if you adapted that thinking in everyday in your everyday mission, like what we're enforcing here, does this make the community better? Does it make it safer? Does it make the people trust us more? Or are we just enforcing to enforce? Because there's a big difference.
Now, you've talked a lot already about some of the problems that you see and about what it's like to be in the moment and facing, like a suspect, and you're in a situation where you could be harmed and all of the things that go on with that. But if you had to tell the public one or two things that everyone needs to know about policing so that they could have a better understanding of what that profession entails, what would those things be? What should the public absolutely know about policing in order to have a better or more holistic perspective on that profession?
Well, let me stick to use of force. So when it comes to using force, it is almost always ugly. There's when you see on TV, they just point the gun at them, they get on the ground, and they put their hands behind their back. It doesn't work that way. It's very difficult to get a person in handcuffs who doesn't want to be in handcuffs, and some people don't give up no matter what. So they need to understand that when you use force against a resisting person, it never looks pretty. The second thing I would say, misconception that people have of police officers, I think at least some in the political spectrum see it as a corrupt institution or men with no compassion. I think it's quite the opposite. I'm writing a book on police reform and noting things that are wrong and behaviors that are wrong. But most of the men, vast majority of the men and women that I serve with were people of integrity, honesty, trying to do the right thing. And as a Christian, I can say this, some of the best men I know, from pastors to any profession you think of, are police officers. So it is not a corrupt, it's not corrupt people. Notice I argue for a systemic condition, not the darkness of the hearts of many police officers. Although there's guys out there like that, of course.
Yeah. So the last question that I want to leave you with today before we wrap up here is, what would you tell a young person who is considering a career as a police officer?
I would encourage them to do it. And are we talking Christian or non-Christian? Just any young person?
Just any young person.
Any young person. So I would encourage them to do it, but I would warn them and prepare them to say, you are going to get a lot of authority, and as much training as you get in how to arrest people and do the job, you should really focus on how your character will be able to handle that authority.
Dr. Daniel Reinhardt, this has been a great conversation. The book is Rethinking the Police. It's going to be out on November 21st on IVP Academic. Before I let you go, where can people buy the book and find your other work?
It's available wherever books are sold. I know it's on IVP site, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, and people are sending me pictures that they got the book. So if you pre-order, you may get it before November 21st. So pretty much anyone's books are sold.
Perfect. And where can people find your other work or follow you?
I have social media accounts, but I don't really ever check them. So you can find me on the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary website. My email's there, and that's about all I have at this point. So,
all right, that's perfect. Well, Dr. Daniel Reinhardt, thanks for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.